So, all right, a man who truly needs no introduction. Richard G. Jewell, class of 67, served as Grove City College's 8th president from 2003 to 2014. So that seems to be the average tenure now, 11 years, right? Paul McNulty, 2014 to 2025. By the way, think of that. So Brad McNulty will be only the 10th president of Grove City College in 150 years. Dick's tenure was marked by an increased focus on fundraising, completion of major construction projects, burnishing the college reputation as one of America's premier Christian liberal arts institutions. While a student at the college, he was editor-in-chief of the Collegian, president of the Student Government Association, captain of the swimming team. He swam for a legendary swimming coach at Grove City College. 1967 ODK Senior Man of the Year. He's from Bethel Park. He was the youngest member of the college's Board of Trustees when he was elected in 1974. And he served as president of Grove City College's Alumni Association, National Alumni Association, before he was selected as president. Co-chaired the college's first ever capital campaign, Change and Commitment, which raised $69 million, and the Grove City Matters campaign, which raised $95 million. During his watch, the college completed the construction of the Breen Student Union, Colonial Apartments, Rathburn Hall, and STEM Hall, and renovated Carnegie Alumni Center and other buildings. You could truly see his mark tangibly when you walk around the campus and just look around. Prior to serving as Grove City College president, Richard Jewell was a Pittsburgh-based director of the Chicago-based Navigant Consulting, previously held senior administrative positions with the University of Pittsburgh, was general corporate attorney for Harbison Walker, and he's a veteran of the Army, of the U.S. Army. In 2015, so after he left Grove City, he was appointed to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board. He serves as director of strategic marketing for the Berkeley Research Group, which is a national consulting firm. And he's a guest lecturer in the doctoral program for higher ed at Pitt, my alma mater, where I got my doctorate. He and his wife, Dale, over here, retired PNC Bank executive, have a married daughter, Jessica, and they have 2 granddaughters. And let me add, I always say that we wouldn't be here right now if not for Dick Jewell. So he got this started as the Center for Vision and Values, chose me to be the head of it. That would have been around about 2004. So we're at our 20th anniversary right now. And this is his, I think, 5th talk in this series. And he owns the attendance record. I thought I had him in September with a talk on Reagan and Trump and 2 assassination attempts, but I can't catch him. So he set the attendance record once again, another sellout, as you could tell. So please join me in welcoming Dick Jewell.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to see everybody. There are so many friends. I look around these tables that Dale and I have had the opportunity to get to know over the years, and that's one of the most fulfilling things about being a president of a college. Now, we knew a lot of folks before, then we get to know a lot more folks. And to be honest with you, the hardest thing about my presidency, and I think Paul would say this too, and others that have had that opportunity, is when folks get even a lot older than you and they pass on. And you wind up going, and it seems a little weird, you wind up going to their funerals and thinking about their lives as Grove City students, as Grove City alums, and the various wonderful things that they did within their community, within their state, in some cases within this nation of ours. And that was one of the great, it's about people. You know, those buildings at Grove City are beautiful, but they're inanimate. Those are inanimate objects. The animation of Grove City College for 149 years, soon to be our 150th, are the men and women who have gone before us, the shoulders upon whom we stand, the president's shoulders upon whom I had the opportunity to stand on those shoulders. It is about people, and people that have made a difference in their communities, in their state, and in their nation. So it's great. It's great to have a new president, 150 years next year, and so The average president will have served 15 years, but here is the tenure of each of our presidents. 38 and a half years. 3 years, that gentleman was the chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Princeton and had been recommended, I've seen the letters to us, by Woodrow Wilson himself, who was the president of Princeton at the time. The next president, Whittaker, 40 years. Our next president, Dr. Harker, 17 years. Dr. McKenzie, who's the same age as Brad Lingo, he about 46, 47 years of age. He served 20 years. The next president served 4 years. Dr. Moore, my predecessor, served 7. I had the opportunity to serve 11, and the Honorable Paul McNulty served 11. So and this gentleman, as our president-elect, I'm sure he's going to do a great job, have the opportunity to serve many, many years because of his age. And that's a hallmark, too, of Grove City. So congratulations, Deb. Ed Breen picked, I thought, our chairman, a great search committee. That was my first sense of it when I saw the folks that were on it. I know they did a great job looking at 70 applicants that wanted to be the 10th president of Grove City College. And I think they've chosen another lawyer. That's our 3rd lawyer in a row contributing to the Full Employment Act for lawyers, I might say, on behalf of the college. So I was kind of happy to see that. And this is actually, Paul, my 7th or 8th talk here. And I sort of have a cottage industry that I've really enjoyed. I have about 15 different lectures that I do. I've done a whole bunch here and enjoyed it. We're about to hear about Ike, and I've had a lot of fun in my research on Mr. Eisenhower. But I also, last year, was asked to speak to the annual meeting of the Daughters of the American Revolution. 88 women and myself. Yes, indeed. And that was a lot of fun. We talked about the Constitutional Convention and something that was very important to them. And the Sons of the American Revolution will have me soon to speak on the Whiskey Rebellion. That's a lecture that I've done here before. But I always, when I do a lecture again, I've added more research to it and have a lot of fun. I learn from each lecture about what folks are interested in and then, what to add. So let's talk about Dwight Eisenhower. Born in 1890, died in 1969. So Ike, and I'm going to call him Ike because that was his nickname from childhood. His one brother, Edgar, was Big Ike, and he was Little Ike. And so he was known as Ike throughout his life in the vernacular to the voters, to the citizens of the country when he was serving his great military roles. And the day before he stepped down from the presidency as our 34th president, he wrote to a whole host of his friends. He had some great friends. It's just like Grant. Remember, I did Grant, too, for this group. And there's a lot of similarities between Ike and Grant. Now, I'll draw a couple of those similarities. But he wrote to his friends, and he said, I've been known as Ike my whole life till I became president. And he said, as of tomorrow, I will no longer be president. I want you to call me Ike. And that was something that was very, very important to him. So let's talk about the formative years of Eisenhower, and then the military years of Eisenhower, and then it's a whole huge subject to cover in a short period of time. When we get to his presidency, instead of going fact by fact, year by year, I'm going to give about 7 or 8 themes of Eisenhower that were really significant and important and interesting as to how he viewed the governance of this great country. I would say this, nobody in the 20th century was better prepared. Nobody was better prepared from what he had done before, what he had done in international relations, in the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, who knew all of the international players incredibly well. From de Gaulle, you name it, on to Harold Macmillan, to Anthony Eden, etc. Nobody was better prepared to be president. Now, while he was well known within military circles, not to any of us or historians really until 1941 when he became famous, and then for 20 years he was the most famous American in the world. Before that, nobody really knew him unless you were in the Army. But the fastest person ever to come to the presidency of the United States, Mr. Obama was one. Mr. Nixon was another, came from almost nowhere, to be president in 7 or 8 short years. But as I said when I did the grant, nobody came further, faster, from more anonymity than Ulysses Grant. 1861, he's working as a clerk in one of his dad's stores in Galesboro, Illinois. In 1862, he's a full bird colonel, and he draws up the troops from the state of Illinois. 1863, 4 and 5, he goes to be a 3-star and then 4-star general, and he's the savior with Mr. Lincoln of the Civil War and of the Union. That was really the fastest. But let's spend some time with Mr. Eisenhower. And where's Mr. Rankle? He was here. Put your hand up, sir. Oh, right there. Graduate of West Point, class of 1960, and he was telling me some great stories about seeing Mr. Eisenhower, who frequently, when he was president of the United States, loved to come up to West Point, where, of course, he was graduated in class of 2015. The class the stars fell on, and I'm going to talk about that. 59 members of that class got 1 star, 2, 3. 3 of them got 4 stars, and 2 of them got 5 stars. And it was the class that came of age and were the great leaders in the Second World War. So Ike was born in 1890, I should say, and it's in Abilene, Texas, and he's only there for about 6 months. He has 5 other brothers, all 6 boys, born to his mom and dad, who were fundamentalist Mennonites and pacifists. Interestingly, Dick Nixon, of course, was the son of Quakers, also pacifists. So by their religious training, the 2 great leaders in the Eisenhower administration of those years, and Mr. Nixon goes on to a presidency in his own right, had a slight problem at the end. Nixon was a genius. He had a little unhealthy paranoia, which I think was one of the great challenges of Mr. Nixon. But they both came from families that were pacifists. Within 6 months, the Eisenhowers had moved from Denton, Texas, and back to Abilene, Kansas. And that's really where Mr. Eisenhower, where Ike views as his home. And he grew up with 6 brothers, all playing sports, all on a farm, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. The Bible and prayer was incredibly important in the Eisenhower family. At night for family prayers, at church, at dinner, and all the lunches and breakfasts for grace. But the Lord was center in the Eisenhower family. He lived in a very small rented house. And of the 5 other brothers, one is somebody that folks have probably remember also, and that was his youngest brother, Milton, who was 9 years younger. Milton was twice president of Johns Hopkins. From 50 to 56 was president of Penn State University, and was also president of the University of Kansas. And Milton had worked in the agriculture department during the Depression years as one of the great thinkers and philosophers of government. And when his brother was the 34th president, was a key advisor to Ike. His boyhood, therefore, was mostly in Abilene, Kansas. As I said, revolved around worship and the Bible and sports. Milton Eisenhower said, quote, "Mom had a song and a joy in her heart, while Dad had the authority." And here's what Eisenhower wrote about, a quote that I think is great from his memoirs, about growing up in Abilene. In 1947, Ike said, "Abilene provided both a healthy outdoor existence and a need to work. These same conditions were responsible for the existence of a society which more nearly than any other I have encountered eliminates prejudice based upon wealth, race, or creed, and maintains a standard of values that placed a premium upon decency, integrity, and consideration for others. Any youngster who has the opportunity to spend his early youth in an enlightened rural area has been favored by fortune. And so you have to understand the upbringing of Ike and how it shaped and molded his character and his philosophy, as we'll see later on in his government. In Abilene, as I said, one was Big Ike, and that was Edgar, and one was Little Ike. And Eisenhower was a great athlete. He was great at baseball and terrific at football. He also had a very explosive temper, which was very famous in his early years. And his mother, and I've read the whole story, and Eisenhower talking about it, finally sat him down when he was 10 years old and helped him to understand that that explosive temper of his was not good, was going to bring great trouble, and had to be controlled. Now, Ike, in private, as a senior officer and as president, would occasionally explode in private, never in public. And he understood that, and he understood the necessity of keeping that temper in check. He gives all of that credit to his mother. In school, he was terrific in spelling and math and military history. And that would also describe George S. Patton Jr., and I'm going to talk about the relationship between General Patton and General Eisenhower as young Army officers and as they grew up together. At age 14, he was out in the field playing football, and he slipped, like we all do, and skinned his knee. The knee got seriously infected. And within 2 weeks, the town doctor wanted to amputate his leg. Eisenhower refused to have his leg amputated. This is in the day before a lot of modern medicine as we know it today. And his brother Edgar slept outside Ike's room door so no doctor could get in there and take his leg off. And he slept there for a week. And then it started to heal, and it healed perfectly. So he was able to keep his leg. But that was, of course, very important and something that was important that his brother helped. In 2010, he made a great friend, the son of the town doctor, Swede Hazlitt. And Hazlitt becomes one of his friends for life. And this is back in the days when people wrote letters to each other. Doesn't that sound interesting? Wrote letters to each other. Jefferson, as we know, Jefferson hated to speak. He didn't like to get on his feet. He was great at writing letters. There's 5,000 letters that Jefferson wrote and that people wrote back to him. So the history of Jefferson is known through letters. And that's how we know a lot about the earlier figures in our history, including, and Ike's not that early in our history, back to Eisenhower, the letters that he wrote to his friends, including Swede Hazlitt. Hazlitt went to the Naval Academy, and Ike, at the same time, though, decided he was going to go to West Point. And so he gets on that train and goes east, the first time he's on a train. And in some ways, it's sort of like, so Ike goes, and it's sort of like the great general from the Civil War when he went off in 1841, Ulysses S. Grant, to West Point, his first time on the train. And they both wrote about that train trip. Both of them went, couldn't wait to get there. It was a complete foreign, new experience, but both went with a great deal of confidence. And the understanding of Eisenhower and the word confidence, not arrogance, not an arrogant confidence, but a confidence in his ability to relate to people from the time he was small, and his confidence in himself intellectually, very, very bright, is one of the hallmarks of Dwight Eisenhower throughout his entire life. And he felt very confident in going to West Point. At West Point, he plays football. And in his sophomore year, New York Times identifies him as one of the great football players emerging in America. And in those days, the Army team, the Navy team, Notre Dame, Fordham, Columbia, some of the New York schools were the leading football schools in the country. And Eisenhower was a halfback. He was fast. He went to West Point at 6 foot, 170 pounds, solid muscle, and handsome. He was a good-looking guy. He lost that hair over time, but he still was. He had that great grin, that Eisenhower grin, that ability to shake hands, to look people in the eye, to enjoy being with people. All of those were hallmarks of Eisenhower from the time he was young, all the way through his presidency and then as an elder statesman. I like Ike. That was the term when he ran for president. And a lot of people, they liked Ike. Ike and Dick when they ran together in 1960. In the Tufts football game, though, in his sophomore year, he injured his knee badly. And then the next week, well, he probably shouldn't have been, he's riding a horse in the cavalry area of West Point. He falls off the horse and tears so many ligaments that ends Eisenhower's football career. But what does he become? The coach saw in him a great coach. He becomes the head coach of the plebe, of the first-year football team at West Point. And that's another interesting hallmark of Eisenhower, his ability to mentor, to coach, and to work with troops. Football players first, and then troops. We'll talk about that. Was really a hallmark of his great skills and what he was incredibly well recognized for. He graduates from that class the stars fell on. I talked a little bit about it, how many stars fell on their shoulders in 1915. And he's assigned to Fort Sam Houston with 3 other classmates as second lieutenants. G. Giroux, G-E-R-O-W, Walton Walker, and Wade Haslip all became 4-star generals in World War II. Think of that. And a 5-star. The 4 lieutenants that were assigned to Fort Sam after that class of 1915 and what they ultimately became. And a young lady was visiting another fella down there that same year that Ike arrives at the fort in San Antonio. And her name was Mary Geneva Dowd, Mamie Eisenhower. And within 2 months, he proposes to her and marries her 2 months later in Denver, Colorado, where she was from. She came from a well-to-do family in Denver, the Dowd family. And so he marries right out of college. Grovers will probably recognize that phenomena. It's, I think, still going on today at a much higher rate of speed than most other schools, as far as I know. And he goes back with Mamie to Fort Sam. It becomes known as Club Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a great entertainer, a great card player. He loved playing bridge. He loved socializing. He was great with his peers and with his superiors. And he was a natural. He was comfortable. He was absolutely a natural. In Ike and Mamie's first 35 years of marriage, they moved 35 times. And in fact, the Eisenhowers never had a home of their own that they owned until they purchased Gettysburg, the farm at Gettysburg, in 1960. In April 17, the United States enters World War I. We were late into the war. The war had begun in 1914. We don't get there, but it's important we did in April of 17. And by the next November 11th of 18, the war is over. So once we get in the war, it takes us a while to kind of get up to speed. Remember, the United States not till after World War II, essentially didn't have a standing army. As soon as we went to war, it took us a while to gin up. The industrial capacity of the country made a huge difference. I think we know that story. But as soon as war was over, we went right back down to a very small standing army. And after World War II and the Cold War, of course, that was different. But he's in the Army, of course. He's a captain. And there's two things about what your rank is in the Army, especially when wartime hits. You have a temporary rank, you have your permanent rank. Eisenhower's permanent rank was not going to become a full bird colonel, permanent rank, until 1950. No matter how good you were, how spectacular you were as an officer in the United States Army in those days, you still had to wait your turn in order to move up through a field grade and to full bird, and then eventually, if some could, into generalships. Now, you could get a temporary rank, and war would advance a temporary rank. So that Eisenhower turned out to be, remember I talked about him being a coach? He turned out to be a great trainer. He was at 2 forts briefly, training infantry folks to go over to World War I. And then with 6 months, we didn't know the war was going to be over in 6 months. With 6 months to go, he was sent to Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And at Camp Colt, he became a temporary lieutenant colonel, and he was the commanding officer of the nascent tank training corps with the early tanks in World War I at Camp Colt. He had 600 officers under him and 10,000 enlisted men. And for those of you that know, how many have been to the battlefield? How many know Gettysburg somewhat? If you look where the Pickett's charge stepped off, and you go through that swale as they go up toward Cemetery Ridge, that's where Camp Colt was located, with thousands and thousands and thousands of troops, and where Ike was the commanding officer, just 2.5 years out of West Point as a lieutenant colonel. Now, the fella probably that got a temporary rank faster than anybody was George Armstrong Custer back in the Civil War. Custer graduates from West Point in the class of 1861. He finishes in his class dead last. But he sure could ride a horse, and he was a great cavalry officer. Within 2.5 years, he was a 2-star brevet general leading the cavalry for the Union against Jeb Stuart out west and east of of Gettysburg, holding off on the second and third day. Played a very important role. And then when he went on, ultimately, of course, the great Battle of Bighorn, where he died, he was a full bird colonel, but that was an acting role. So Ike, in the off years between the war, very few people stay in the Army. The Army reduced within 2 years after World War I to 135,000. And within 5 years after that, not one regiment, not one unit was combat ready. We had the 16th largest army in the world. That's how fast that we would always shrink our army down. Of course, Ike, graduate of West Point, the thing he really wants to do besides training, he wants to get to war. He wants to get to World War I. And sure enough, he was scheduled to go overseas with one of the armored regiments, the early armored regiments in the United States, on November the 18th of 1918. And of course, when on November 11th, we know what happened. The war ended. So he did not get to go to war in World War I, which he was very unhappy about. However, after the war, he continues his training of troops, and he winds up at Fort Meade in Maryland, where a fellow named George S. Patton, Jr., class of 09 at West Point, is a little bit ahead of Eisenhower in the tank philosophy and in tank training, and he winds up working with George S. Patton, Jr., and they became very, very close friends. You couldn't have had 2 more different people. And for those of you who have seen the movie Patton, I'm sure many here have, or maybe have seen it more than once, it's the most realistic picture of its kind ever made. Ladislas Farragut, who was the great biographer of Patton, was the primary advisor on that movie. And Omar Bradley, the great friend to Patton, was the advisor, too, on the military history for Patton. And that movie is about as accurate as any movie could possibly be, about an individual and that individual's skills and proclivities and interests. And remember what a some would say ruthless, but really a tough general that Patton was. The only difference from that movie, and I've heard this, George C. Scott, who portrayed Patton, did such a great job, had just a great voice. A lot of people don't realize Patton had a very high, squeaky voice. And if you've heard him in the newsreels after the war, right after the war was over, back in New England selling war bonds, you'd just go, holy mackerel, you think you're going to hear George C. Scott's voice come out of George S. Patton Jr., and it's not quite the same. But they were very, very close. But while at Fort Meade, there was a colonel there who became a general named Fox Connor. And this is a very important thing in Eisenhower's building of Ike, and that is the mentors that he served under in the off years between the wars. Fox Connor was the chief of staff to General Pershing, who was the commanding general in World War I for the American forces. Connor was considered one of the great generals that ever lived, and he was a general that loved to mentor younger officers. He meets Eisenhower, and they develop a tremendous relationship. And 2 years later, Connor is assigned to the 20th Infantry Regiment in Panama, in Panama in the Isthmus, and he takes Ike with him as his chief of staff. And for 3 years, Ike is tutored by one of the great generals that ever lived, and they are constantly talking about military subjects, military movement of troops, public policy, the kinds of things that are important in a political way to the armed forces and the combat arms. And he receives a tremendous tutelage from Fox Connor. Connor called Eisenhower the greatest, most level-headed officer he'd ever met in the United States Army. High praise indeed from one of the great generals of all time, not generally known to the public at large today, but very important in his time with Eisenhower. When he finishes with Fox Connor, John J. Pershing then, in the mid-20s, asked Eisenhower if he'll go back to France and write the history of the United States Army in World War I in France. He gets two of those assignments from Pershing. Pershing loves the work that he does, loves the way that he writes, and this is another two generals that were phenomenal writers. One was Ulysses Grant. When Grant, dying of cancer, writes his memoirs, he does it without an editor. He does it almost without anybody helping him or correcting him. He does it from memory, and he is a brilliant, brilliant writer. Those are probably the best written remembrances of war and of a military life ever written that Ulysses Grant wrote at the end of his life. He also was a brilliant guy writing orders, and he wrote all his original orders after he understood the topography of where they were going to be in battle. And Eisenhower had some of those very, very same skills. Ike, of course, having been in France, now becomes the historian of the United States Army in their efforts for 18 months in what was called the Great War, and thought of to be the last world war we would ever have. More on that later, I might add. After that, Pershing sends him to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Command and General Staff College, there are two colleges that the colonels are sent to and that future generals all have been to. So not everybody going through these two colleges, as they're called, becomes a general, but that is an important way station on your way to a generalship. And at the Command and General Staff at Leavenworth, he finishes first in his class out of 272. And that is a one-year program where there's a tremendous amount of studying of past battles, of how you framed the battles, what the strategies, what the tactics were, how they were fought, how you might fight them differently, how you would understand the supply chain problems that would occur within war. And Eisenhower finishes first in his class. That, of course, is very significant. Now, when he finishes first in his class, Patton writes him a letter, and I want to quote from the letter that Patton writes. And he says, it's really not about those kinds of decisions you've just been through. Patton had been to Command and General Staff 3 years before. He said, the real question is, what makes, and I'm going to have to quote, I'm quoting Patton here, and his language is a little questionable, but for historical purposes, for a Grove City audience, I think you'll accept it. He said, it's what makes the poor SOB who constitutes the casualty list fight, and in what formation he is going to fight. The answer to the first is leadership. That's what makes it happen. And to the second, he said, I don't know. But he did know that any doctrine based on super-trained heroes is bull. The solitary son of a bitch alone with God is going to skulk as he always has, and our advancing waves will not advance unless we have such superior artillery, and all they have to do is walk and shoot and be led. Patton told Eisenhower that now that he'd graduated from Command and General Staff, he should stop thinking about drafting orders and moving supplies and start thinking about some means of making the infantry move under fire. He prophesied victory in the next war will depend on execution and not plans. So, well instructed Eisenhower is. He finishes at Command and General Staff. He does the 2 tours over in France, writing the history. And when he comes back, Pershing sends him to the Army War College, which, of course, today is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Army War College is more of a doctrinal instruction, less than on tactics per se. 100 officers are in 20 groups, mostly colonels, full-bird colonels, 5 different groups of 20 officers, and they have some foreign generals from other countries that are mixed in. And I had the opportunity my second year as president to address the Army War College. The commandant at the time had been a young second lieutenant back with me at the 3rd Armored Cav back in the 1969 through 71. And he and another second lieutenant, they were both just out of West Point, had stayed in the military. They'd both gone to Nam after that. They stayed in, both became major generals in the Armor Corps. And interesting enough, all 3 of us wound up being college presidents. And we would bump into each other 30 years later at conferences of college presidents. But this particular gentleman who was commandant of the War College asked me to come and speak. He knew that Grove City College and the Army had something really very much in common. That is, we had great sense of not only decorum, but kind of the historicity of principles. But yet we were in a modern world. And then how did we adjust to the modern world, but not lose those principles that inspired the founding of the college, and in the Army, the founding of the nation and the combat arms? And so I spoke for 45 minutes to the assembled officers and just had a wonderful time. Now, in the afternoon, they broke into different groups, and the one group that I worked with, they were talking about how to raise money from Congress in order to pay the bills for the combat arms. And the general, who I knew well from being much younger, had indicated, and some of you know this, for 40 years, I've raised money for political folks. It's kind of one of my hobbies. And so we have a state rep here, just did this, Mr. Schaefer, in the last election cycle. And so he's going through some of the folks that I knew and who knew me. And one of the colonels put his hand up. He said, sir, he said, how did you get to know all those political folks? I said, well, Colonel, I don't want you to take this answer the wrong way, but when you raise money for politicians, they're always damn glad to see you. So that was my one day at the Army War College. Ike was there, and he did top of his class again. He did just a great job. Then, he's now ready to move on, and he hooks up with another mentor, and that is General MacArthur. MacArthur was Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 30 to 34. He was a 4-star general. That was a 4-star post. And Ike was his kind of second in command. And MacArthur was not a mentor. He was somebody to be seen, to see how he handled things, to work with and for, but a mentor he was not. Here's what Ike said about MacArthur in Ike's memoirs. He said, MacArthur is as decisive, personable, amazingly comprehensive in his knowledge, possessed of a phenomenal memory. He said, but Mac was a peculiar fellow who had the habit of referring to himself in the third person. As to his egotism, he could never see another sun in the heavens. Quote, but he did have a hell of an intellect. My God, but he was smart. He had a brain like none other that I have ever seen. But Mac could read a speech that he had prepared one time and repeat it verbatim. And in fact, I talked to Mr. Shankle, who had missed his great duty honor country speech by 2 years at the Academy when MacArthur received the Sylvanus Thayer Award. The two greatest military speeches about heroism and sacrifice I have ever read. One is only 242 words, that's the Gettysburg Address. The other was 15 pages, and that was the duty honor country speech of Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur wrote it, looked at it once, and delivered it verbatim from memory. And it is a remarkable speech. And this Memorial Day, I'm going to speak in a cemetery to 1,000 people or more. And I'm using that as the hallmark of my speech, the duty honor country speech of MacArthur, and also work that I've had a chance to do with the Society of Heroes that have won the Congressional Medal of Honor in South Carolina, and talking about what some of those great people did to obtain that award. But that was MacArthur. He was with MacArthur from 1930, when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, till MacArthur finishes in 35, and MacArthur then retires for the first time from the Army, and he goes out to the Philippines, where President Quezon had asked him to come out and form an army. Remember, we had taken control of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War, and that was the far frontier of the United States and its own defenses, if you will. See Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, and what happened as World War II started with Japan in 1941. But Eisenhower went out to be the aide-de-camp and the number 2 guy to MacArthur in the Philippines. MacArthur becomes a field marshal of the Philippine Army and forms the Philippine Army. But while MacArthur got that fancy uniform that he had in a unique way he dressed and how he spoke, he had an incredible intonation. Eisenhower was really doing the work on a day-to-day basis, night after night after night. And what's important to remember and to think about Eisenhower as he's growing up, as he's growing through command, as he's growing through his own training and the training he receives at the highest levels of the United States Army, he's an incredibly hard worker. Eisenhower could easily, and as president, work 7 days a week. That was not unusual. He got kidded about playing golf, right? You remember the stories about Ike playing golf. But that was his only relaxation. He not very frequently worked 7 days a week for weeks on end. He had an incredible ability to do that. After the Philippines, Ike comes back as the war, of course, starts in Europe on the 1st of September, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. Didn't come to the United States per se until Pearl Harbor, a year and a half later, with the 7th of December. Eisenhower comes back to the United States in 40, and he's a lieutenant colonel, and he's the XO of a regiment in Fort Lewis, Washington. And that's where the 3rd Cav was when I served with the Cav for a year and a half. And sure enough, on Officer Row, there's the brick house that Eisenhower lived in that's set aside as a museum. And he was there for a year and a half with Mamie on the base training until Pearl Harbor. And on the 12th of December, 1941, he receives a call from Beadle Smith. We'd hear more about Beadle Smith, who was a great colleague to Eisenhower and to Ike during the war. And Beadle is working as Chief of Staff to George Catlett Marshall from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, who is the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And the gentleman in charge, we don't have a Secretary of Defense, we don't have that infrastructure. We have the Army and we have the Navy, and in the Navy are the Marines. So it's the Navy and the Army, and George Catlett Marshall is the great liaison to Franklin Roosevelt in preparing us for war and bringing us into war, a war in the Pacific and a war in Europe. And there was a tremendous amount of which theater is going to get the emphasis, which theater should get the emphasis, how are we going to fight this world war. Eisenhower reports on a Sunday, takes a train east from the West Coast. He gets there on the 15th. He comes in and sees Marshall. He had known Marshall, seen him 2 or 3 times over the years. He knew Marshall, as Fox Connor had said to him, get to know Marshall. He is the greatest, and turned out to be so all those years later. He sits down, and Marshall briefs him on what's happened in the first 5 or 6 days of the war. The Philippines are under attack. The Japanese have ended the Air Force, or the force on the ground. Planes were shot down. We'd lost carriers. We'd lost a battleship or 2. But not the carriers. Fortunately, the carriers were out to sea on the 7th of December. And he briefs Eisenhower, and he says to Ike, he said, what would you do? That's the question he asked him. And Ike listens to him, and he said, give me 3 hours. I'm going to think about it. He goes away for 3 hours. He comes back, and he gives a tour de force to General Marshall about what he would do, especially out in the Pacific. Remember, he had spent 6 years out in the Philippines, so he knew that area incredibly well. Chief of Staff listens to him late that night on a Sunday. He says, okay, Eisenhower. He never called him Ike, never called him Dwight. He always called him either Eisenhower or Mr. President. Except one time, right after the war, he was so excited about them having won, and he's with Eisenhower for the first time. He called him Ike, caught himself after he had done that, felt very embarrassed, and proceeded to call him Eisenhower 3 or 4 times in the next 5 sentences to correct his mistake. He was a very proper gentleman. And so Eisenhower becomes the head of war plans for the Far East. He now gets a 1-star, and within 2 months, he's named the head of all war plans by Marshall. And he, again, temporary, he gets 2 stars. And he's tasked with the command of the first amphibious landing and our first entree into the war in the North Africa landing in the late fall of 1942. He plans that with Friedendahl, with Patton, and with Bradley. And in early November, they make the landing in North Africa on the west coast. And when he gets to that part of Africa, it's controlled by the French, by the Vichy French. Remember, when Germany had invaded France, they had taken Paris, they had taken the northern part over as German, but they left the rest of it in Petain's control and hands in a French former general who was running France, but it was actually a kind of a Nazi state. And Admiral Darlan was the commander of the French ships and fleet that was in North Africa. Eisenhower sits down with Darlan, and what he doesn't want is to have the French fighting against the American. They're not the Free French, they're the Vichy French. And he works out a deal that Darlan will stay in charge militarily and politically in that part of Africa in exchange for the French not picking up arms and for giving the fleet over to America. This was a tremendous tactical approach that Eisenhower took to avoid unnecessary casualties. But he was highly criticized back home. It almost cost him his job because people back home and politicians back home did not want to see the Americans dealing directly with the Nazis or dealing directly with the Vichy French. And Eisenhower had a very close call, and unless Marshall had really stood up for him, which he did, and backed him to Roosevelt, that might have been the early end of Eisenhower's career. He also, in the tactical approach to the war, remember, he had not commanded troops in battle. This was his first time, and he's going up against mostly German troops who've been at war for 2 years. The German troops were really good troops. They were tough fighters. They had all the tactics, they had been well trained, and they'd been at it for quite a while. So it took America and their allies longer to clear out northern Africa and to get over to Tunis on the east coast to ready to go up to Sicily. It took them probably 3 or 4 months longer, and they suffered a lot of casualties. And Eisenhower was criticized that he was not a commanding general of troops, but he knew how to write orders and how to get the supplies there. He was a great planner, but it took Eisenhower a while to get his sea legs as a fighting general. In order to do that, you had to fight. And that was the experience that he was going through in North Africa. He then goes up through Sicily with Patton and with Montgomery and with Bradley. And it takes them a little while longer to take Sicily, but they do take Sicily, and they're now ready to jump into Italy. When they jump into Italy, the Italian troops give up. They're no longer in the war, but the Germans took over Italy. And now Mark Clark, the great general, is fighting going up the west coast of Italy, and it takes Clark a much longer time. It was a very tough battle for Clark to be doing that. In the meantime, Eisenhower has been moved back to England, and he's been chosen by Roosevelt and by Stalin and by Churchill, because he got along with those great leaders. That was another hallmark of Eisenhower, to be the commanding general for Overlord, that is the invasion across the English Channel into France, of France, and then ultimately into Germany, hopefully to end the war. And Eisenhower is then in London, and he's planning for the D-Day assault. He's working night and day and then some. He has almost no sleep. And by the way, he smoked an average of 90 to 120 cigarettes a day. He was a 5-pack smoker of cigarettes. Stopped overnight cold turkey in 1948. That didn't do his heart any good, ultimately. And some of his other health problems, I think, are related to that. That's an enormous amount of smoking. There's a great story of the first time he'd come over to England, and he's in a briefing by he became Field Marshal Montgomery. And Montgomery had a strict rule: no smoking in my tent or where I am or when I'm making a presentation. Ike, of course, lights up. He's enjoying one of his 90 smokes a day. And Montgomery said, "Who's smoking in this tent?" And Eisenhower said, "Well, I guess it's me." I don't, So it wasn't for that reason. But Eisenhower, in his relationship with Churchill, terrific. With Bomber Harris, terrific. With the air people, terrific. but with Alan Brooke, the commanding general in the UK, and Bernard Law Montgomery had a very bad relationship. They didn't like Eisenhower. They didn't think he was the guy that should be leading everything. Now, an American had to be because of the nature of America's, what they put into it. But that was never a good relationship throughout the war and even afterwards. So it was very, very difficult. Well, Eisenhower goes through Germany, and it looks like the war is going to be over by August of 1944. Paris has been taken. Patton is going wild in the southern part of Germany. They're crossing the great rivers. But all of a sudden, winter sets in, and Hitler counterattacks the Battle of the Bulge through the middle of all of their forces in the Ardennes forest. That begins on the 8th of December and ends the 29th of December. And they made that salient, when they went through, advanced about 50 miles and killed a lot of Americans. And all of a sudden, we're in a heck of a war. It sort of had the effect of the Tet Offensive back in Vietnam. It looked like things were being handled fairly well, and all of a sudden, boom, on Tet, there was that tremendous offense by the North Vietnamese, and everybody went, whoa! They weren't expecting that, and they started to wonder, is this war going south? Are we in trouble? Eisenhower knew that it was Hitler's last gasp, and he had sufficient troops and everything to finally push back at Bastogne and to push back that salient. And by the 7th of May, of course, the war is over in Europe. Eisenhower comes home for a short while. He had not seen his wife for 2 years. And sure enough, he had a driver named Kay Summersby. I do have to say a word or two about Miss Summersby. And of course, there was a lot of, she was always in the pictures with Eisenhower. Mamie was not happy, not happy. And the question was, did Ike and Kay Summersby have a relationship? Kay Summersby said yes in a book that she wrote after the war. I think they were close, there's no question. And there was one story that Eisenhower had come to Marshall and said he wanted to divorce Mamie and marry Kay. And Marshall said, that'll be your last day in the Army. And now, there may or may not be truth to that. I'm sorry to even say that. But there was enough out there, and it was a significant issue at the time. But after the war, Kay went her way, and Ike back to Mamie, for the rest of their life. And so no one has ever proved it beyond a reasonable doubt, but there was some concern about that, and that was talked about quite a bit at that particular period of time. At the end of World War II, and for the 2 years prior, Eisenhower is world famous. Ulysses Grant became world famous. And even General Washington, although he didn't get on a plane and fly to Europe, couldn't do that, Washington was world famous, especially in the guys he beat in London, but the French really spent a lot of time talking about Washington. So the generals of those great wars became unbelievably famous. And Eisenhower had essentially no money. He didn't have money. He wasn't born to money. Mamie had some money, but they had lived on their Army salary, which was pretty small. So when the war is over, the question is, what is Eisenhower going to do with the rest of his life? Well, he's going to become the Army Chief of Staff on the 20th of November, 1945. He's going to become the president of Columbia University, and he's become the president of the United States. So he had a pretty interesting afterlife, obviously, from the war. And when he becomes the commanding general, he's actually paid, in today's dollars, about $240,000 a year. And that's what a commanding general of the Army today, or chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is paid about that amount. So I've taken all of the numbers from those days and moved them to what the value would be today. And after the war, he develops a lot of friends. Eisenhower was the guy to know, the guy to see, the guy to be around. And he loved about 7 or 8 really tremendous friends. Most of them were CEOs of major companies. First thing that happened was a number of major companies came to him and said, "We'd like you to be our CEO or our chairman." No, he said, "I don't believe in trading on my name and my fame for something like that." Some other great generals did. Homer Bradley became the chairman of the board of Bulova Watch Company on Long Island, for example, and others worked in the higher echelons of corporate America right after the war. Eisenhower said, "I think I might like to be a small college president." How about that, small college president? Just at that time, Thomas Watson, the founder of IBM, one of his friends, comes to him and said, "Ike, we have a presidency available at Columbia University. We'd love to have you there." He signs up for Columbia University as president, and he comes there on June the 1st, 1948, and he serves there until the day before he's president of the United States, our 34th president. But during that time, he serves as the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He serves as the first commanding general in Europe of what becomes the NATO command as NATO is being formed. So he's off doing all kinds of other stuff for a couple of years at a time when he ran NATO, but he's still the president of Columbia. Now, at Columbia University, he was paid, in today's dollars, $230,000 a year, and a five-star general was always on duty and was paid about $250,000 a year. So he finally started to make some decent money in those two, five-star general and as working at Columbia. Now, when he goes to Columbia University, he says to Dr. Watson, he said, "I will be glad to take that job, but I won't do fundraising. I don't want to get involved in academic matters. I would not like to do extensive entertaining." Now, I'm going through these things having been a college president. Holy cow. That's how he took the job, and they wanted him. And he went to Morningside Heights, and so he had the president's house at his disposal from 48 to 53, unless he was in Europe or doing something else at the same time. He finishes at Columbia while he is the commanding general of what is the precursor to NATO, all appointed by Harry Truman. And the most interesting thing about Ike is, in 1948, everybody likes Ike, and he is a leading candidate for president. But what party does he belong to, right? This is just like Grant. He was going to be president. What party was he going to be part of, and how soon was that going to happen? The similarities. They all had great friends that did wonderful things for him. For Eisenhower, they built the Eisenhower Cottage down at Augusta that's still there today. He had the run of all kinds of opportunities and free planes and this and that. And that was okay to do in those days. It was just respecting him and doing things for him, as Ulysses Grant took a tremendous amount of advantage. I don't mean that in a negative way. I have to put it in the cycle of the time. That was not improper. So Truman came to him twice and said, "If you run for president on the Democratic ticket, I'll run for vice president." This is President Harry Truman. "I'll run for vice president." Well, Ike, in 1948, didn't want any part of running for office. And he wrote the following: "It's my conviction that the necessary and wise subordination of the military to civil power will be best sustained, and our people will have greater confidence that it is sustained when lifelong professional soldiers, in the absence of some obvious or overriding reason," he did find that in 1952, by the way, but in the absence of some obvious overriding reason, abstain from seeking higher political office. Politics is a profession, a service, complicated, and in its true sense, a noble one. My decision to remove myself completely from the political scene is definite and positive, a Sherman-esque-like statement, if ever there was one. This was in 1948. Now, I thought Dewey was going to win. So did most other people. So did Dewey. And as we know, we have that famous picture of Harry Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune with the headline, "Dewey beats Truman," with this big smile on his face, because that didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, Eisenhower truly did not want to run for president, did not want to be president in 1948. And he thought that Dewey would win and would get a second term. And by that time, Eisenhower would be way too old, not by today's standards, but way too old to run for president, wouldn't be considered presidential material. And so he was very careful about that. But now he is over in Europe, and he's trying to put together a European defense force, the precursor to the NATO army, consolidated army. He thought putting everybody together was the best bulwark, the Allied bulwark against the Soviets. We're now in the Cold War. And he finds out back here that the leading candidate for president in 1952 is Taft, Senator Taft, and he's an isolationist. He doesn't like NATO, and Eisenhower says, "I'm going to run." A lot of wealthy people and friends were coming over to Europe to get Ike to run. He doesn't come back in 1952 until June. It's way after primaries. The election's, 5 months away, and he resigns his, he doesn't resign his commission, but he steps down as the NATO commander, and he declares himself running for president. And he's the odds-on favorite. And of course, the first choice he's got to make is a vice president. And here's one of the themes. I'm going to do 2 or 3 of these themes. One, Richard Nixon. Nixon was chosen for obvious reason, and a communist, younger, from the West, Ike's from the East. It was a good ticket balance. It was a good intellectual balance. He didn't know Nixon. He'd met him at the Bohemian Grove in 1950, one time when he was back in the States out in San Francisco. But Herbert Brownell, who had run Dewey's candidacy for president and later was Mr. Eisenhower's attorney general for most of his 2 terms, Brownell was a brilliant guy and very wise political mind, and he was the one that had selected Nixon. And there were no other good second choices. He was never excited about Nixon. He couldn't warm up to Nixon. One of the reasons was he was a 5-star commanding general in World War II, and of course Nixon was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, just like Jack Kennedy was a lieutenant, which is like a captain in the Army in the United States Navy. He looked on these fellows as whippersnappers. And so he just could not get used to Nixon. The Nixons, Mr. and Mrs. Nixon, were never in 8 years invited to the private quarters of the White House to have dinner or to sit and have a cigar or a drink with Ike or with the Eisenhowers. And so it was kind of a standoffish, although he used Nixon. Ike was not real excited about politics, so he used Nixon. My phone going off, excuse me. I once was doing a political fundraiser for Mike DeWine when he was a senator, and we're at the Duquesne Club. There's about 100 people there, and all of a sudden DeWine's phone goes off, and he has 8 kids, so he's always getting phone calls. So DeWine picks up the phone. He's now the governor. Picks up the phone, turns around, and spent 15 minutes talking to his one kid while the rest of us were waiting there for him to finish so we could finish the fundraiser. Sorry, that just reminded me. I thought I had that off. So in any event, Eisenhower becomes president. And here's a number of things that are important to remember about Ike as president. Very significant. In his upbringing in life, you had to have a budget, and you didn't spend more than you ever had. Consequently, in his 8 years, he had 3 balanced budgets, one that had a $10 billion surplus. His budgets were around $100 to $102 to $110 billion. And what would happen, especially in the Cold War, was a lot of members of the House and the Senate, both Democrats and the old guard Republicans, would come running at Ike and saying, we need more weapons because of the Soviets. We need the S-70 bomber. We need this, we need that. And Eisenhower knew better than anybody what was needed and what wasn't. He understood status of force. He understood the Soviets. He understood the lay of the land like nobody. Consequently, they couldn't horse feathers Eisenhower or force him into spending money on weapons that he didn't think we needed. In the Eisenhower administration, our nuclear devices went from, and that would be tactical nuclear weapons, to the bigger bombs, to the H-bomb that was developed. We went from 1,500 to 6,000 nuclear weapons in our stockpile. Eisenhower's view was that was enough to kill every Soviet and everybody in the world 3 times over. Why do we need more to kill him 4 and 5 and 6 times over? And he was constantly putting his hand up like that and saying no. So for all of his years, most historians will tell you, we saved ourselves billions and billions and billions of dollars on expenses for weaponry that we didn't need. He also understood 2 things about the Soviets. They had been so decimated in World War II, and they had 10 million died. Stalingrad, we know the history's there. Just an enormous expense of troops. He said the Soviets were so beaten down, they weren't about to do any invading, notwithstanding Khrushchev's bluster over the years that Eisenhower was president. But he said, we have to come to grips with the fact that in those days, then the French got a bomb, England had one, and the French actually sent a lot of their knowledge to the Israelis. Nobody acknowledges, including the Israelis, that they have the bomb. They do. They do. And I will tell you right now, if they were pressed to the absolute back of the wall by the Iranians today, we would see a bomb used. And we could see a bomb used. God forbid. And that's the other thing that Eisenhower, God forbid. He understood the terribleness of war, especially now nuclear war. And he said, a large war is unimaginable, and a brief, short war is unwinnable. We're going to have stalemates because we're always going to be afraid when we're in South Korea or where we're somewhere else that the Soviets are going to come in with a bomb, that the Chinese are going to come in with a bomb. They'll be afraid that we're going to come in with the bomb. And that's actually had an interesting impact on geopolitics since that first 2 atom bombs were exploded. It's really changed the dynamic and the analysis. Eisenhower understood that. He was unbelievably careful about those things. Race relations. Well, 1954, Brown versus the board. Separate but equal. The Plessy-Ferguson case of 1898 that said, yep, you could have separate but equal, and that created the segregated world in which we lived. De jure in the South, de facto in the North. Supreme Court with unanimously and with the leadership of Earl Warren, who Eisenhower had appointed, of course, overcomes that. But the court says we're going to proceed with integration with all deliberate speed. The court knew, and Eisenhower definitely believed this, 2 things. Number one, that it was going to take a lot more time to change hearts and minds, which you had to do for the true acceptance of the Brown decision, especially in the South. And that was significant. Secondly, Ike viewed that as a state problem, not a federal problem, unless somebody refused the order of a federal judge. And then, of course, he was, by the Constitution, under Article 2, to protect and defend and to enforce the laws, that he would have to do that, which he did in Little Rock in 1957 when they refused to allow the integration of the Little Rock Nine and refused a federal judge's order. And Eisenhower then nationalized the National Guard in in Arkansas, I should say, and then brought in the 101st Airborne to get that taken care of. He hated to do that. He did not want to have to put troops in the South, but he was tested at that regard. And back in those days, both Eisenhower and Mr. Kennedy were really nervous about civil rights acts and things like that, because under the seniority system in the House and the Senate, the Southern barons ruled the great committees of the House and the Senate, and consequently had a lot to say or to do to stop or advance a president's agenda within the Congress of the United States. And they had to be, very, very careful. So accordingly, Eisenhower was very careful. So in some ways, too, he set back the advance of civil rights by only enforcing it when it was a judge's order and leaving it, more to the states. The size of the military. He understood what the size of the military it meant. He also understood that the bomb gave him leverage, some negotiating power, although we weren't going to use it as a first strike. But we wouldn't need quite as many troops because we had the Big Bang. And he used that in a threatening way, but not with the intent to use it ultimately, but in a threatening way in Kamoi Matsu and some of the interdictions with the Chinese back in the mid-1950s. The other thing is he wanted to reach, and this term became a nasty word, I guess, in some folks' mind, some détente with the Russians. And he said, here's what he said: the Russians are going to spend themselves out of existence. That's exactly what happened. He predicted precisely what happened in the Reagan era and the process that was going on then. But he presented two great thoughts to Bulganin and then Khrushchev. One was atoms for peace. In a summit meeting in Geneva, he talked about using atomic power for safety, for atoms, for life, not for death. And he also talked about open skies. He was trying to reach an accord with the Soviets so that we could know, trust but verify, remember Mr. Reagan's mantra, though we could know that if they were standing down from nuclearization and that we could see that the other was doing it. They could see that we were doing it, and they could then feel more comfortable about that. And so he made two significant proposals that were the early proposals, not accepted by the Soviets, but really started to crack the ice in what would come later, especially with Nixon and Nixon's time as president. Those were Eisenhower's views, and he held them deeply. Ike won his second term, even after suffering a heart attack. And the heart attack he suffered was in September. The election was going to be not that November, but the next November. And the way they took care of heart attacks in those days, they said you have to go to bed for 3 months. So as soon as he suffered that heart attack, Dr. Paul Dudley White, who was his great heart expert from Boston, sent him out to his in-laws in Denver to recuperate. Some of you may know, just before Christmas, I suffered a major heart attack. Here's the difference. I was in the hospital 3 days. They did a stent. The day after I got out, I was on a treadmill, and I only missed 1 week of work. That's a whole different way of taking care of hearts today than Bill McMillan, my great doctor for many years, helped me understanding, drawing great pictures of hearts as I came to understand what had gone on. And so he recuperated, ran for office, 157 to 43. It was that's a landslide, and was elected to his second term. The big disappointment finally in his second term was the following. He had okayed U-2 flights over the Soviet Union beginning in 56. Nobody knew about it. Soviets knew about it for sure, but they couldn't do anything about it. And so he had invited, in his détente view of Soviets, he had invited Khrushchev to come to America in 1960, which he did, and had a great 10-day trip around America. And they were going to have a summit in May of 1960. One more U-2 flight went over the Soviet Union the first week of May, to Eisenhower's regret. He had to okay all of them. And the Soviets had finally gotten the capability at 70,000 feet to shoot the plane down, which they did. And the Soviets made a huge hue and cry about that. They captured the pilot. They had the plane that had crashed. And that ended the summit. And that ended what he thought he could get done in that period of time in detente with the Soviets and start denuclearization. And so Ike leaves office. He thought Nixon might win. Nixon was, it was close, 118,000 votes. And there might have been some horsing around in Illinois and a couple of other states. Nixon chose not to contest and gave the election over to Kennedy, and the rest is history. Eisenhower liked Kennedy. He got to know him. He liked his earnestness. He liked his questions. He showed the general a great deal of respect. And the first thing, and I'll close with this, that he asked Kennedy was, "I'd like to become a 5-star general again." That's what meant the most to him. And he had to resign the day he became president of the United States. And so Lyndon Johnson run in the Senate in those days, Sam Rayburn, and Kennedy, within a month after Kennedy takes office, they reconstitute the 5-star rank of General Eisenhower. And he liked to be known as General after he finished, or Ike to his friends after he finished his years in office. So that's Eisenhower, a very, very significant player in American history, who made tremendous, tremendous contributions in geopolitics, in finance of a country, and in having a very comfortable way of governing and not getting us over our skis. Glad to take some questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
We'll do one question, and then after that you can ask the direct questions. Okay. So you better make it good, whoever it is.
Sir.
Yes. I wonder what influenced Mr. Raymond Pitcairn, under whose I served as a houseboy at this summer estate long ago in the Catskills, what influence he had on Mr. Eisenhower's decision to become president.
To be honest, I know the name. In the research I've done, and I do a fair amount, Pitcairn did not come up in his memoirs. So I can't respond to that. I don't know. One more question. We'll take one more. Yep.
You described a meeting between Ike and General Marshall shortly after Pearl Harbor. Marshall asked Ike, "What would you do?"
Mm-hmm.
They went out 3 hours and came back with a plan. Does that mean that Ike is responsible for the island hopping strategy in the Pacific?
That's correct. That is correct. Well, the commander to that, you're exactly right. The commander of that was MacArthur, of course, but the island hopping strategy was part of his war plan doctrine. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, everybody. And by the way, parking is free here, huh? That's great. You could get a place to park. And we actually go a little longer than we usually do downtown, but I hope you'll forgive me. Thank you kindly.